This is the 10th day of our session. I welcome the President of Nagesh, the President of Athletic Federation of India, Sri Adil Sumarwala sir, and also the Chief National Coach, Sri Bahadur Singh ji. I welcome to this, and I welcome all the participants. I feel ashamed to repeatedly inform you that please don't say write in anything in chat box, because we find difficulty to identify the questions. Because, for example, about 600, 700 participants are typing their introduction in chat box, then it is very difficult for us to find the questions in the chat box, that may be 20 or 30. So again, and unfortunately, I'm ashamed of again instructing this. Even the President Athletic Federation also has instructed you all. मैं हिंदी में भी बोलता हूँ, आपसे अपेक्षा करता हूँ आप ये चैट बॉक्स में अपना इंट्रोडक्शन मत कर दीजिए. चैट बॉक्स भर जाता है और चैट बॉक्स भरने के बाद हमें क्वेश्चन फाइंड आउट करने के लिए बड़ी मुश्किल हो जाता है. So please don't do it. And it is repeatedly given in message as well as informed you also. So please don't do that. Now, very interesting session. Walker Herman, Mr. Walker Herman, no need of much introduction. He is our high performance director and globally a sports consultant as well. And he is also World Athletics Coaches Education Editor and World Athletics Coaches Education Certification System Level 2 and 3 lecturer. So welcome, Mr. Herman. You can start with our session.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. Today's topic is about strength training and how we're going to apply the methods of a modern strength training, specifically with athletics, but I think it's of relevance for other sports as well. Yeah, please put your questions in the chat if they have any, and avoid from writing down your name so that our coaches can easily identify the important questions you are raising during the presentation. I'm going to share my screen now. So I hope you can see the presentation. Yeah, when we're talking about strength training, it's not only about developing the muscles. Yeah, previously we've discussed this already, that we need to work on technique and coordination, because that actually helps us to apply the muscle strengths. But in addition to the active structures, the way the muscles are working, we also have to consider other physiological variables, the passive structures, for example. That means the tendons, the ligaments, the tissue. We know that muscles are attached to the bones via the tendons, and the tendons are the ones who are actually applying the muscle force, the strength towards the joints. Yeah, we also have ligaments around the ankle joint, for example, or the knee joint to stabilize the joints. And we have so-called soft tissues around the muscles to stabilize and also to help with the relaxation of the muscle. Formerly, a lot of coaches, like you can see here, they focused on pure strength training. But scientists have realized that especially the fast sprinters or the fast distance runners, you can see the legs of Eliud Kipchoge here in the middle, they have very long Achilles tendons, for example, or relatively long patellar tendons around the knee as well. And these Achilles tendons or the patellar tendons or the tendons in general, they help us to transfer the strength which is produced in the muscles towards the joint, and they help us to make our movement more efficient. So in a modern strength training, we also have to consider not only to make the muscle stronger, but to increase the stiffness of the tendons, which are attached to the different muscles. Yeah, because if you make the muscle stronger, but you don't affect the tendon, a lot of energy will be dissolved in the process. And only if muscle and tendon are working holistically together with each other, you can be assured that you are able to apply as much force as possible, close to 100% of the force they're actually generating. And these long tendons are also the reason why kangaroos, for example, pretty sure you've seen these animals in Australia, are able to jump very high and very far because they have extremely long Achilles tendons. That means they're able to save a lot of energy. Their muscles are relatively short, but the energy which has been produced in these muscles will be stored in the Achilles tendons during the so-called eccentric movement, that we're going to discuss afterwards, and reutilized during the concentric part of the movement. And that makes our propulsion more effective. You've already seen this slide. We need to, if you want to develop speed, we need to improve our strength level, and we have to pair it with a proper or decent level of coordination and technique. And the combination of strength and coordination or technique will immediately increase your speed or your power. And that's actually what we're looking for in athletics. We need to accelerate the movement of our athletes. And it does not matter whether it's a sprint start, whether it's a takeoff during a long jump action, or in the throws, for example, in the shot put or the javelin throw. It's always about accelerating your own body or an implement in the throws. Because the release velocity or the horizontal velocity is the most critical factor when it comes to performances in athletics. And this release velocity or the horizontal velocity in the sprints is highly depending on the acceleration of your body. In the sprints presentation, we have seen that faster sprinters, they show a steeper or a faster acceleration, and at the same time, they're accelerating for a slightly longer time in comparison to mediocre athletes. And this acceleration is directly related to your strength level or your athlete strength level. So we have to be assured as coaches that we never conduct strength training just for the sake of conducting it. Every session, and specifically in the gym, has to fulfill a specific purpose. And in our case, this purpose is to improve the acceleration. So acceleration equals mass, that's mainly the body mass, multiplied by acceleration, force equals mass multiplied by acceleration. And another equation is that acceleration then equals force divided by body mass. So if we only have to propel our own body, like in the sprints or the jumps, what we've discussed already, we need to increase the strength, and at the same time, we try to maintain the body weight, the mass of the body. Formerly, we've seen relatively bulky, very muscular sprinters being successful. But nowadays, you can see that there's an entirely different trend. A lot of athletes, finalists in the 100 meter, 200 meter, but also in the 400 meter are actually relatively skinny. And we can see Wade van Nieuwkerk, the only person who was able to run below 10 seconds on 100 meter, below 20 seconds on 200, and below 44 on 400 meters. Here we have Zhu Bingtian, the Chinese sprinter who last season also ran significantly below 10 seconds. Here we have Zori, the 100 meter world junior champion. And you can see that all these athletes, despite running below 10 seconds or being very close to 10 seconds, are relatively skinny. Being skinny does not mean that they're not powerful. It's quite the opposite. These athletes are able to increase their strength level, but to a certain extent to maintain their body weight. And that's actually what we're looking for in a modern strength training. To make our acceleration more efficient, we need to increase the strength level, but we have to look for ways to at least maintain our body weight or only have very little weight gains because of the strength training. So acceleration, remember this, is force divided by mass. And that means we need to increase the strength level, but we should maintain the body mass, because otherwise, if you're increasing your strength, let's say by 10% within a year, but because of a huge hypertrophy effect, and hypertrophy means that your muscles are getting bigger, the cross-section of your muscles is increasing. If you're increasing your body mass also by 10%, you see that the acceleration will be exactly the same. So in any case, we have to increase our strength level to a bigger extent than we're maintaining the, then we are doing the body mass. In the optimum case, we're increasing the strength level and we are maintaining the body mass, and we are avoiding such bulky physical structures of our athletes. In the throws, it's a bit different, because in the throws, we have to gain a certain momentum, especially in the discus throw and the shot. And if you increase your body mass and you're able to accelerate this body mass, it might be a bit easier to transfer this momentum onto the implement. That applies mainly to the shot and the discus throw, partially to the hammer throw and to the javelin throw as well. But you can see more skinnier athletes actually in the javelin throw and the hammer throw in comparison to some of the discus and shot put events. So keep this in mind, increase your strength level, but try to maintain your body weight. So by talking about strength training, we have to separate in a few different muscle actions. We always have so-called dynamic movements and static movements. Dynamic simple means we can see, if you're observing your athlete, we can observe a movement. Static means there's actually no movement. The athlete is not changing his or her position. And during these dynamic movements, we have so-called concentric actions and eccentric actions. Concentric means that the muscle is getting shorter. That usually means the tendon is stretched. Yeah, we have a high muscle activation, for example, when you do a biceps curl. An eccentric action means the muscle is lengthening. Still there's activation, and the tendon attached to this muscle is also activated. And when it comes to static movements, we have so-called isometric actions. Again, that means there's no change in muscle length at all. We can see in a concentric movement, the muscle length is decreasing. In an eccentric action, it's increasing. And for a static isometric action, there's no change in length. So if you compare this to different sporting movements, you can see, for example, we have isometric movements in boxing. Yeah, when the fist hits the opponent's face, in this case, there is very little or almost zero movement of the arm any longer. Still, we can see there's a high activation of the biceps, the triceps muscles. That means we have an isometric contraction. And the only situation that we find such an isometric contraction in athletics is actually during the sprint start. Yeah, in the set position, there is no movement of the body at all, but we know that the glutes, the hamstrings, the back extensors, the shoulder muscles and the arms here are highly activated because they're preparing for a very quick push off the blocks. And that's called isometric contraction. A concentric action is, for example, when you do biceps curls. You can see the biceps muscle here shortening. And we have a concentric action when we leave the starting blocks as well, especially in the front leg. Yeah, it's a pure extension. Again, we're using our hip extensors and the hamstring muscles and the lower back to extend the hip to forcefully drive off the block. And on the other hand, we have eccentric actions, and they occur mainly during running and jumping movements, of course, during the sprints as well. Some scientists nowadays say that even in the throws, for example, in the pectoralis during the discus throw, that we have a lot of eccentric action before the final release of the implement. So as a rule of thumb, we can say that eccentric muscle actions are most important for athletics performances, as well as for injury prevention. So in strength training, over the career of an athlete, we have to focus more and more on eccentric strength training rather than concentric strength training, because we will find way more eccentric movements, dynamic eccentric movements in athletics in comparison to concentric movements. And always keep in mind that during the eccentric part of your technique, for example, during the ground preparation or the early ground contact in the jumps and the sprints, we are saving a lot of energy in the tendons. This energy will be reutilized and is supporting our push off the concentric muscle action at the second part. Yeah, but we see in athletic movements, the highest activation of the muscle, the highest load on the muscle occurs during the eccentric movement. And by using the right way of strength training, of course, we have to prepare our athletes for such loads. So this is a brief overview about different training methods. You can find the different methods on the left side. And you will see that these methods are directly related to intensities. And these intensities are always related to the so-called one repetition maximum. Yeah, if you're going for one maximum repetition, if you want to go for personal best, for example, in the bench press, yeah, this is called the one repetition maximum. And you can see that the intensity here, for example, if you do hypertrophy training, is around 70 to 80% of the one repetition maximum. So if you have, let's say, a personal best of 100 kg in the bench press, if you want to affect hypertrophy, you're training with 70 to 80 kg. And that requires approximately 8 to 12 repetitions. You can do, according to your level, 3 to 8 of these sets. That means 3 to 8 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions each. And we also have certain adaptive responses to this hypertrophy training. If you do hypertrophy, that means we're mainly increasing the so-called cross-section of a muscle. The muscle is getting bigger, a bit bulkier. That means muscle mass is increasing. And remember the slide before, that we don't necessarily, in the sprints or the jumps, we don't necessarily want to see this hypertrophy effect, because it will have a negative impact on our body weight. Yeah, so with hypertrophy, we know the muscle mass is going up, but the so-called intermuscular coordination remains more or less the same. So you can only increase the muscle strength via hypertrophy if you increase the mass. That might be okay for the throwers, for the sprinters and the jumpers. In a certain way, it could be a disadvantage because of the increased body weight. So in a modern strength training, we have to reconsider the idea of conducting a lot of hypertrophy work in our training. Actually, a lot of coaches, especially at the senior stage, and I will explain this later, are trying to avoid hypertrophy training. Based on this intensity, we also have a so-called intermuscular strength training. That means the coordination in between the muscles, especially if you're doing multi-joint movements like whole body exercises like cleans, a snatch. Yeah, we can usually stay between 80 and 90% due to the higher intensity, and the number of repetitions is decreasing. And we see the impact on the coordination of the central nervous system is a bit increasing, and the impact, the negative impact on the muscle mass, is slightly decreasing. If we further increase the intensity, we're talking about sort of intramuscular strength training. That means we're improving the coordination in between the different alpha motor neurons within a single muscle, yeah, in between the muscle cells, the muscle fibers. And that requires relatively high intensities. We need to further decrease the number of repetitions. The number of sets might be more or less the same, but we see there's almost zero effect on the muscle mass. We're able to maintain our body weight, but the coordination of the central nervous system is significantly increasing. So we're getting stronger without adding a lot of additional body mass. And the same applies to eccentric strength training, where we reach very high intensities. The same also applies to so-called speed strength or power, where we're looking for very fast movements. I will explain this a bit more in detail later. And when we're talking about speed strength, we usually apply 40 to 60% of our one repetition maximum, 2 to 6 repetitions, because of the fatigue of the central nervous system. If you're going for more repetitions, your central nervous system will get tired and you're not able to apply high contraction velocities any longer. Also, the number of sets is decreasing, but we see again, very little increase in muscle mass, but a high impact on coordination. The same applies to reactive strengths, for example, plyometrics, where we usually don't use additional weights, where we go for very quick repetitions, small number of sets, and again, it has a very high impact on the central nervous system. We're talking about strength endurance, especially for the middle distance runners or the 400-meter sprinters. Intensity further reduced, but you can see the number of repetitions is increasing. Number of sets might be the same, and we have neither a huge effect on the muscle mass nor on the coordination. And the strength endurance aspect, that's something we will also discuss within the next minutes, because there have been a recent change in the structure or periodization of the training years with regards to strength endurance training. But keep in mind that you always adjust your strength training according to the intensity The methods you're using are always based on the intensities of the strength training, and these intensities will directly impact the muscle mass, the cross-section of your muscles, and thereby the body weight, and the coordination, that means the impact on the central nervous system. So if you see this progression, for example, from 100% of your repetition maximum, let's say here in a bench press, yeah, you have an athlete, maybe a young shot putter, who's able to do a bench press with 150 kg, and that means exactly 1 repetition. If you're looking for his 10 repetition maximum, you can see, okay, this is around 110 kg. If you look for his 20 repetition maximum, you can see, okay, this is around 90 kg. So it becomes very obvious that this is not a linear progression. And that's something you have to consider with your athletes. Yeah, we see a lot of charts where you can calculate, okay, what is the weight you can use for 100%, what is the weight for using for 90%, for 80%. But these charts are usually following a linear model, and they're not applicable to a proper strength training. So I can just encourage you, try to do some testing with your athletes, measure what is, maybe for a senior athlete, what is the 1 repetition maximum, what is the 3 repetition maximum, maybe the 10 repetition maximum, and so on, so that you identify this curve for your athlete. It will definitely help you to improve the quality and to make your training more specific. And because we're talking about a non-linear progression. And again, every load is always given according to the percentage of the so-called 1 repetition maximum. Yeah, if you're able to do 1 repetition with 150 kg, then 10% lesser would be 135. So that means, okay, here in this aspect, we're training intramuscular strength, for example. It means, okay, you can probably do 135 with 4 to 5 repetitions. Yeah, but again, develop these curves for your athletes, because you cannot generalize here due to this non-linear progression. You see, it's not a straight line, it's more like a curve, and we have to identify how does this curve, according to the number of repetitions, look like for our athletes. So in general, talking about strength training, we have 3 performance limiting factors. And whatever strength exercise you're doing, it goes back to these 3 aspects. And one is called the activation of the muscle. How many alpha motor neurons or muscle fibers are activated? We're talking about the force-length relationship of a muscle and the force-velocity relationship. Yeah, considering the muscle activation, again, we have to see what is the intermuscular coordination and the so-called intramuscular coordination. Remember, intermuscular coordination usually happens at around 80–90% for multi-joint whole body movements, or we have intramuscular coordination above 90% of your 1 repetition maximum. The coordination is in a muscle, or if you have a very senior athlete, also certain multi-joint movements. But here we can say, for the intermuscular, and inter always means in between, yeah. Remember the interstate competitions, the states are competing against each other. And it's the same here, we have an intermuscular coordination, how the muscles are working together. They're together in groups, and the better the coordination in between this muscle is, the better is the output. Yeah, keep in mind what we discussed during the coordination session, that every movement is based on so-called motor patterns, and this intermuscular coordination, of course, impacts the motor patterns in your central nervous system too. So in addition to the coordination in between the muscles, we have to consider the intramuscular coordination, how the different muscle fibers within a muscle are working together. And if you are dealing with a beginner or with an untrained person, interestingly, only 70% of the fibers within one muscle, for example, your hamstring muscle, are able to work together at the same time. That means untrained human beings are not able to utilize 30% of their muscles. So they will never be able to fully exploit their potential. They are stuck at around 70%. But if you conduct regular intramuscular coordination sessions, this rate may be raised up to 95% in highly skilled athletes. That means experienced athletes, top athletes, are able to use 95% of their muscle fibers at the same time within the muscle. An untrained person, only 70%. So you can see we're getting much stronger, yeah, without having any increase in muscle size, because this is purely based on coordination. That again requires a certain intensity, as you've seen in the chart before. What you have to know about this muscle activation is that we have two different general types of muscle fibers. There are much more, but I think it's enough for you to separate into two. We have so-called slow twitch fibers, which are mainly designed for endurance loads. And we have so-called fast twitch fibers, which need or require more energy, but they are able to support you when you are sprinting for very quick movements. And these slow twitch fibers, they are attached to the so-called alpha-1 motor neurons. They have a relatively low threshold. The fast twitch fibers, on the other hand, they have a high threshold. So what does that mean? Every muscle fiber, and you can see here the muscle fibers, yeah, they are attached to bundles, to fascicles, and then we have the overall muscle. But every muscle fiber attached to a motor neuron has a so-called threshold. The threshold simply means the trigger, how much electric energy is necessary to activate these fibers. And the reason that the slow twitch fibers have a low threshold, that means it only requires a low energy level to activate these fibers, is because the slow twitch fibers are working way more efficient than the fast twitch fibers. As the slow twitch fibers, that's why we usually find them with endurance runners. They don't need a lot of external energies to produce muscle power. The fast twitch fibers, which we mainly find in sprinters, they require a lot of energy. That means they're not very efficient. And that is the reason why the body always starts working with the slow twitch fibers first, before adding the fast twitch fibers to any movement. Because slow twitch fibers are more efficient, yeah, and only if this is not enough, the fast twitch fibers are added. If you imagine a hybrid car, for example, working on electric energy with a battery, yeah, if your car runs out of electric energy, it probably uses fuel out of the sun if you're having a hybrid car. And that's exactly the same as our muscle. If the efficient economic energy is not enough to, for example, produce a certain amount of energy, if you want to have a very powerful or very fast movement, only in this case the fast twitch fibers are added to the movement. But every muscle activation starts with the slow twitch fibers first. And that's what we have to keep in mind, because we need a high load of at least 90 to 95% of our run repetition maximum again to affect the fast twitch fibers. Yeah, and that means we need to focus on inter and intramuscular strength training. If you're conducting hypertrophy training at around 70 to 80%, it means that mostly your fast twitch fibers are not even affected. So you're making your slow twitch fibers bigger and stronger, but the fast twitch fibers, the ones we actually want to recruit for our sprinting, jumping, or throwing movement, are not even activated. Yeah, so we have to, in strength training, go for the high intensities as quickly as possible. That, of course, does not really work with kids with whom you introduce strength training, because they are still growing in a certain way. The growth plates are probably not fully developed, and we have to avoid such high intensities. But again, that's something we're going to discuss later. There's the other way to affect the fast twitch fibers is if we go for very fast muscle contractions, like speed strength or power or plyometrics. Because in this case, the slow twitch fibers are simply not quick enough to activate the muscle. Yeah, remember, we want to have very short ground contact times. That means we have to apply a lot of force within a very short amount of time. And only the fast twitch fibers in our bodies are able to support such a quick impulse. And the downside here is that this amount of fast twitch fibers is given by birth. Yeah, it's based on heredity. So we can say, I'm pretty sure you've heard about this, you can develop a marathon runner, but you have to be born as a sprinter. And that's because it's impossible or almost impossible to increase the amount of fast twitch fibers, only to a very, very small percentage after you've been born. The problem is, I've mentioned this earlier already, that if you do a lot of endurance work or slow work with your young athletes, the fast twitch fibers might turn into slow twitch fibers. But this is an irreversible process. Yeah, there's no way to make fast twitch fibers out of slow twitch fibers. So we have to be very careful, especially with developing athletes. We have to ensure that we are affecting the fast twitch fibers regularly and that we avoid too much endurance loads to avoid a turn into the slow twitch fibers. So very powerful or very fast contractions to increase the strength of our necessary fast twitch fibers. Please keep that in mind. Then the second aspect determining the strength of a muscle is the so-called force-length relationship. Here on the left side, we can see a very contracted muscle. We have the so-called actin and myosin. I'm pretty sure some of you will recognize this. And we have a lot of overlapping between actin and myosin filament. I don't want to go too much into the detail. So if you are stretching now, you're actually pulling the muscle apart, or the muscle fibers apart from each other. That means we only have very little cross bridges here between the actin and myosin. And you can see the blue line. If you are stretching your muscle, if you're reducing the number of cross bridges, yeah, the blue line indicates the strength. You see the strength level is reduced. So a stretched muscle is not able to generate or to apply as much force as a relaxed muscle. A contract muscle, as you can see it here on the very left, yeah, typically for bodybuilders, also is not able to generate and apply as much strength as a relaxed muscle. And that's what we're looking for, this plateau. So with training, we can slightly shift this plateau either to the left or to the right. If you're always doing biceps curl, or let's say hamstring curls, with a full range of movement, you have a very high chance that your athlete is getting stronger, that this plateau is shifting to the left towards a bended knee position, for example. But what I mentioned earlier, we know that the highest activation of our hamstring muscles in the sprints, the running, the jumps, always occurs at the late part of the general ground preparation phase, or at the early ground contact phase. And we know that this applies to a large knee angle. Yeah, faster athletes or better jumpers, they show less amortization. That means they also have a wider knee angle, close to 165, 170 degrees. So if we know that we have the highest activation of our hamstring muscle at a knee angle of approximately 165 degrees, and we know about this force-length relationship, for us it makes sense as coaches to develop this plateau of maximum strength slightly to an extended, a stretched position. Yeah, so instead of doing hamstring curls with a full range of movement, we should probably focus on a wider knee angle. And that's the same for all the other muscles as well. Yeah, of course, in general preparation, sometimes it makes sense to use a full range of movement. But if your movement gets more specific towards the end of general preparation, special preparation, we should always train our muscle at specific angles due to this force-length relationship and to the small shift we can actually gain when we're training the muscle in a stretch position, for example. Here you can see one way. This is an exercise for the hip flexor, and you can see this athlete has a fully extended hip position. Exactly what you want to see in the sprints or in acceleration phase, for example. Now you can see the heel here is attached to a pulley system, and I'm going to show you the exercise. So based on this pulley system, we have a very high activation of the hip flexor muscle here at this fully extended hip position. And you can see she tries to do it very rapidly, very quickly. And the reason for this is even in the hip flexors, we have a so-called stretch shortening cycle. Yeah, similar to the Achilles tendon, to the patellar tendon, also including all these tendons for the hip flexors. As the iliacus muscle, the psoas muscle, we have a so-called stretch shortening cycle. And we know we have the highest activation of the hip flexor here in this extended position. That's where we have the highest activation. And that's the position in an almost extended way of the hip where we have to train this muscle. A lot of coaches, what they're doing, they're using resistance bands, for example, to train the hip flexor. The problem is an resistance band. Let's say you're going back to this position. In this position with a resistance band, you would have the highest activation here in a banded position of the hip. But you all know this is a so-called transition phase. And during this transition phase, when we have the transition from the knee lift to the hip extension or hip flexion to hip extension, we don't even use the hip extensor any longer. So it makes no sense to use a resistance band to have a high activation of the hip flexor in a position where we don't require any strength any longer. And we require the highest amount of strength here in a flex position. So always consider this in your training and conduct the strength training, which is contributing to the muscular load and not the opposite way around. Another example you can find here doing a hamstring curl. Yeah, a lot of coaches or athletes are conducting a hamstring curl over the full range of movement. That means the weight is coming very close to the glutes. Yeah, but we know in the recovery phase, we actually want to have very relaxed hamstring. And we need a high activation of the hamstring at the late phase of the ground preparation or beginning of ground contact. And that means we have an almost 170, 165 degree angle of our knee. So it makes more sense to train the hamstring muscle at such a wider or larger knee angle in comparison to small knee angles. So what you can do, instead of going for the full range, you just focus on a small range, yeah, maybe 150 to 170 degrees. Because this makes your strength training more specific, and we're developing the muscle exactly in the way it is needed afterwards in training or competition. Yeah, again, there's nothing wrong if you want to do this in the beginning, maybe it's the first mesocycle just to get used to the load over the full range of movement. But when you want to make your training more specific, and if you want to avoid injuries, train your muscles in specific angles. Because if you would train the hamstring in a banded position, let's say, yeah, the weight is moving until here, you have a high activation of the hamstrings at a banded knee angle, which is similar to the recovery phase. But we know in the recovery phase of our stride cycle, we want to have a fully relaxed hamstring muscle. So by using the full range of movement in this case, we actually heavily increasing the number of injuries as well. Then the last of the three major aspects of strength application is the so-called force-velocity relationship. Here on the left-hand side, we have the so-called contraction speed in meters per second. On the x-axis, we have the force in Newton. And there is a relationship between the force and the velocity. And I think you've all experienced this already. Again, if you're going for a 1 repetition maximum in the bench press, if you want to test your personal best in the bench press, you will realize that it's a very slow movement. And you can see the black line here. If you use high strength levels, it always comes along with very little velocity. On the other hand, if you want to go for very fast contraction speeds or for very fast running velocities, yeah, you cannot use a lot of additional weight because the weight will always slow you down. And that's what this black curve indicates. As higher the force, as slower is the velocity. And the blue curve here, that's a curve of an untrained person. The black is the one of a trained person. And you can see the heavy impact strength training has on this force velocity curve. First, it means at same speed, let's say the athlete here was at 7 meters per second, but was not able to use any additional weight. After a few weeks of training, the 7 meters, you can see, okay, it's almost 25 newtons, so a massive improvement. You can also see that here, if in the beginning, the personal best was 200 Newton, and after a few weeks of training, we're able to move this weight 200 Newton much faster than in comparison to before. Yeah, so this is very important for coaches to understand, because we have to see what is the weight we're using. Is it only our body weight we have to move forward? And do we have to move or increase the velocity to move this body weight? Or do we have to increase the strength? Now, this is according, for example, for the shot putters, we know in the beginning, they have to create a momentum. They have to accelerate the body weight, which we will find anywhere here. Here, yeah, a huge load, relatively low velocities. But when you're coming closer to the competition phase, and your technique is stabilizing, it's not that much about increasing the velocity of your body during the initial phase, turnaround. Yeah, it's more about transferring this momentum to the shot. And we know the shot, 7.26 kg, in comparison to 120, 130 kg body weight, is relatively smaller. So when it comes to the release of the shot, the speed aspect becomes way more important. And as coaches, you always have to understand what are the requirements of your events. Yeah, are we looking forward to develop or accelerate a huge mass, or is the mass relatively little and you just have to accelerate and implement the javelin, for example? So these are considerations we have to take for your training. And important for training, and some scientists say that this actually has the highest impact on the adaptation regarding strength training. It's not only the force, but the power. And power, this is the dotted line here, is always a product of force and velocity. And you can see if you have a very high force, but a very low velocity, the power here, yeah, in watt, is also very little. If you have a very high velocity, but very little weight, again we see, okay, the power is very small. And we see the highest power usually anywhere here. And that's around 40 to 60% of your 1 repetition maximum again. Yeah, where we have the largest product of velocity and force. Yeah, force multiplied by velocity equals the mechanical power. And that's what we have to find in training. And I will show you an example later how our top athletes are using such equations to enhance their training. So remember the different percentages we were saying, yeah? Intramuscular strength means 90 to 100% of your 1 repetition maximum. So it's located anywhere here. Very high intensity, very high forces, very high rates, but very slow velocities. If you conduct power or speed strength training, that usually happens between 40 and 60%. So we have an optimal relationship between contraction velocity and the weight or the force you're applying. We have reactive strength with very little additional weight, but very fast reaction speeds. And you can already see, remember that we want to make our training more specific within a season. Yeah, more specific in most cases means faster. That's the reason why in strength training periodization, we usually start with slow repetitions and high weights. And step by step, we're decreasing the weights, we're decreasing the intensity, but we're increasing the speed. So from general preparation to special preparation to pre-competition. And for the more senior and advanced athletes, we can also use eccentric strength training. The intensity is going slightly higher because of the negative movement. Remember, the muscle is lengthening during eccentric movement. And that's why we actually have a negative velocity. And in extension of this curve, the negative velocity in eccentric strength training allows us to even use weights which go up to sometimes 130, 140% of the 1 repetition maximum. So if you're doing a concentric bench press with 100 kg, if you would add more weight in the extended arm position, you might be able to lower almost 130, 140 kg. Yeah, try this with your athletes. but please don't use it before the age of 18 or 19 because of the growth plates and the way the tendons are inserted at the bones. The system is not yet that stable, so that's something we leave for the high-performance senior athletes. But what we have to consider, we always have to train our muscles at specific contraction speeds. Because in athletics, remember, we have very short ground contact times. So less than 100 milliseconds. Yeah, in the long jump takeoff, maybe 110, 120 milliseconds. Even the release in the javelins, I think, takes around 100 milliseconds. So we have very, very little time. And we have to ask ourselves if a permanent training with high intensities is really that sufficient, because we're not improving the speed. And it's not only how strong you are. For athletes, the most important ability is to apply the strength in as little time as possible. And here's the example of Neeraj. I think you know him, our top javelin thrower, performing a snatch. And we are, or the coaches, using a software. There's a small accelerometer at the bar. They are measuring the power. So it's not necessarily about the weight. How much weight are you able to move? It's about how fast are you able to move this weight. Yeah, remember, it's force multiplied by velocity. And the weight here was 70 kg, I think. You can see the velocity here. That is the curve of the velocity. And we see the maximum velocity he's reaching is 2.32 meters per second with 70 kg. If he would reduce the weight to 60 kg, of course, the velocity would be much higher. Here, this 1.30 meter just means how far is the bar going to be accelerated until this movement, when we catch the weight. Yeah, from the ground to this position, it's 1.30 meter. That's important because you can also calculate the so-called work divided by the weight. That also equals the power. But in general, we can say the power is the amount under this force time curve. Yeah, another important aspect is the acceleration. When do we reach the maximum acceleration? Here you can see it's not an optimal technique because he has a little dent here. So sometimes with very experienced weightlifters, for example, you can see it's more or less a smooth line. But technique or technical equipment actually helps us massively to adjust the training of our athletes, because we're not just looking for the weights any longer, especially when we're coming closer to the competitions. We are looking for the power. And power simply means how fast are you able to apply your muscle strength. Yeah, that's why we measure the speed as well as the acceleration. And that gives us an indication of the overall power outcome, which here in this case was 988 watt. So in the beginning of the season, we're probably not looking that much for velocity. We're looking more for developing the maximum strength. So that means higher rates, but lower velocities. And the what amount should be more or less similar. If you're coming closer to the competition, you might even reduce the weights. Remember this 40-60% for speed-oriented strength training, but the velocity will definitely be much higher, and we have to aim for a similar watt amount to ensure a proper adaptation. But again, that's probably a bit high class, just to give you a vision of where to go with your athletes within the next years. And we need this technical equipment to measure such data. Power is quite important, as I mentioned, because this is the ability to apply forces in a short amount of time. And here we can see another scientific study, which has already been in 1974, so almost 46 years ago. But the idea is still the same. If you start with an athlete, and you can see again the dotted line here, after 20 weeks of training, they will be able to improve their force velocity curve. And at the same time, as you can see, they're also able to have a right shift and an upscale of the power curve. That means they're able to generate more power with the same velocity, or they're able to develop higher velocities with similar weights. And that's exactly what we're looking for in athletics. Yeah, so build your maximum strength first, but always ensure you're transferring it into power or speed strength afterwards. And here are another 2 examples, I think, for speed strength movements. So that's a very quick, we call it reactive box step. Yeah, it's only a 20 kg bar, but the idea here is not necessarily to work on a high muscle strength. It's more about applying this strength. Yeah, these athletes, again, she was running 11:22 in 2017, participating in the London World Championships. Her body weight was around 50 kg, if I'm correct. And her personal best in a single leg squat was more than 140 kg. Yeah, single leg squat. You can see she's very skinny, but still very powerful because of this different type of strength training. And despite being able to have a deep single leg squat with 140 kg, now she's only using 20 kg because the idea is to make her fast rather than stronger, especially closer to the competitions. Okay, so yeah, keep this in mind. We need to activate the muscle in the right way. We have to look for proper force velocity and a force length relationship before we start the preparation of our strength training. In India, we can still find a lot of examples where coaches start every season with a phase of strength endurance. And then they only pick up maximum strength in special preparation. Yeah, we have a lot of coaches who in general preparation just conducting strength endurance training. And this is something we definitely have to reconsider. The idea of strength endurance is mainly to have an anatomical adaptation, especially of the so-called passive structures, what I mentioned in the beginning. That the joints, the bones, the ligaments, the tendons, that they're slightly or slowly getting used to higher weights. This does not really work because to get used to a certain load, you also need a given intensity. And with strength endurance training, that means repetitions for more than 15, and that applies to usually 20 to 50 or 60% of your 1 repetition maximum. The intensity might not be high enough to cause these adaptations. Also, from a muscular perspective, there's nothing much going on. So if you are conducting a strength endurance training with your athletes, the biggest adaptation actually occurs in the muscle cells. We call it the so-called local muscular endurance. And this local muscular endurance, there are relatively little improvements regarding the activation of the force length and force velocity relationship. What actually happens is that the number of mitochondria in a muscle is increasing. And just recently, there was another very interesting study published by Fisher and some colleagues, and they indicated that lighter loads and a higher number of repetitions, that means strength endurance training, might negatively impact the chronic muscular adaptations across the duration of an intervention. That simply means it might even have a negative impact on your strength training in comparison to a group which is using heavier loads. And that lighter loads and higher repetitions might not incur neuromuscular or morphological adaptation. And their view is that the preponderance of research does not, that means a lot of articles they've compared, does not support a mere repetition to maximum continuum. Yeah, so it does not necessarily make sense, based on this aspect I just mentioned, to start your season with a strength endurance phase, because you simply might lose time. There is, if at all, there's only very, very little adaptation regarding your muscle strength. There's very little adaptation regarding the passive structures. And if you, with your sprinters, runners, jumpers, throwers, are doing strength endurance in the beginning of the season, it might actually be a disadvantage. And it definitely will be a disadvantage if you compare your athlete to someone who is immediately starting with a maximum strength-oriented training. So please reconsider the importance of strength endurance at the beginning of the season, because from a physiological perspective, there is no indication that this helps you with a performance improvement of your athletes. The reason we want to conduct some strength endurance at the beginning is mainly an anatomical adaptation, but even this, according to science, is very doubtful. So there are other reasons, and this anatomical adaptation simply means if your athlete, after a long season, is experiencing, let's say, a 4 to 6 weeks transition phase, of course, when you pick up training again, start the general preparation, you cannot immediately go for 90–95% intensities. But there will be other ways to work on that. But please avoid strength endurance because it will not help you. And we mentioned already, if you are introducing a proper strength training, we always need a very strong core. And this core training can actually substitute a particular strength endurance session. And the more experienced athletes with a higher training age, again, they don't even need this strength endurance or even hypertrophy in the beginning. So before planning our annual strength training plan, we have to consider a few aspects. Yeah, as a summary of what we've discussed previously, we need to increase our strength, but we want to maintain the body weight. Again, with a few exceptions for the throws. We want to use loads of higher than 90% to affect our fast twitch fibers. We want to use very fast muscle contractions to affect the fast twitch fibers. Yeah, because our main goal in athletics is to apply as much force as possible in as little time as possible or necessary. And that's always related to the so-called rate of force development. We have to reconsider the role of strength endurance at the beginning of the season because we should develop maximum strength as soon as possible. Don't waste your time with training methods which are proven to not work. And we want to train specifically regarding joint angles and speed according to our event. Yeah, and this applies for a season as well as an athlete's career. We're always starting from general to specific and from slow to fast. Remember these principles. Yeah, here's some more principles, of course. When we're talking about strength training, we have to ensure the safety and well-being of our athletes. We need to follow this approach, general to specific, slow to fast, simple to complex. Another very important aspect, we need to keep the variability up. That means after 6 to 8 weeks of strength training, we have to adjust our exercises. It makes no sense for you to do a squat throughout the year because every adaptation is always following a so-called asymptotical curve. And usually that depends on the athlete. After 6 to 12 times the same exercise, the same load, the relationship between input, that means the training, and output, means adaptation, is almost zero. So we have to keep the variability up to prove or to provide new stimulus for our central nervous system. And another aspect when it comes to strength training, we want to get our athletes out of their comfort zone in general preparation or special preparation. During the competition phase or pre-competition, we want to put them in their comfort zone so that they're building some self-confidence. Yeah, so we start with uncomfortable exercise, and I will elaborate a bit more on this afterwards. And closer to the season, we're starting with more comfortable exercises the athletes really like to conduct. Yeah, we've already discussed that we need to do a strength and weakness analysis of our athletes regarding the athlete's profile or predispositions. What kind of body type do we have? What are the strengths and weaknesses? What is the technical level of our athletes? And we have to understand what are the task-specific requirements of our events. Yeah, a hurdler, for example, might need more hip flexor strength and more reactive strength in comparison to a 60-meter sprint. A 400-meter runner might need a bit more strength endurance in comparison to a 100-meter sprinter, and so on. And we have to find the gap between our athletes' current predisposition and the task-specific requirements of the event. And then, step by step, we have to match them. That means we have to get our athletes according to their profile closer to the task-specific requirements of the event we are dealing with. So regarding the performance limiting factors, yeah, and this is entirely different for the different event groups, sometimes even between the disciplines. Yeah, javelin throw requires a different kind of strength training than shot put. 400 meter sprinting requires a different kind of strength training in comparison to 100 meters. The triple jump requires a slightly different strength training than the high jump, things like that. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the prime movers of our main discipline? And we know it's mainly the glutes and the hamstrings, but of course for the thrower, we have to consider additional muscles, the pectoralis, the shoulder rotators, whatever. We have to consider what are the specific joint angles. Where do we have the highest activation of our muscles? Yeah, in the race walk, in the triple jump, in the sprint, whatever. What are specific angular velocities? Yeah, this is something we have to understand. How fast do we have to extend our hip joint or our shoulder joint? And we need to understand what is the duration of the discipline. If you are a 1500 meter runner like Jinson Johnson here, of course you should do some strength training, even maximum strength, because it helps you with your speed development. It helps you to become more robust, but you should not be trained as a thrower, as Neeraj, for example, because you know, okay, the event takes 3.5 minutes. That means the amount of speed and strength endurance becomes more important. So you have to figure out what are the strength-related performance-limiting factors for your event, and then you have to affect these in training. The athlete's predisposition, that includes the age, of course, including the biological, and very important when we're talking about strength training, the mental age, because mental age means your athlete has to understand what they are doing. Yeah, and especially in strength training, remember the safety aspect. They have to be aware of such aspects. You have to consider current and also past injuries when you conduct strength training, and to avoid this, these injuries are reoccurring. We have to ensure that our athletes have a sufficient development of core strength, especially these muscles around the spine, yeah, to stabilize or to ensure we have a proper posture whilst conducting a deep squat, for example. The body type is important. How is our athlete's body responding to strength training? And the so-called preferences. Yeah, remember the comfort zone. In the beginning, we're probably choosing exercises which our athletes don't really like, to push them out of their comfort zone, to challenge them. Closer to the season, we actually want to use exercises which our athletes really like to build their confidence. And regarding the classification, I'm just giving you a few examples. A lot of athletes, they prefer either so-called double leg movements or, on the other hand, single leg movements. Yeah, so you have to make a decision, or you have to ask your athlete, is your athlete more prone towards double leg movements like a squat, or do they prefer single leg movements? If you're training exactly the same muscles here, but this exercise might be preferred, the preferred one for some exercises, other athletes might prefer the double leg movements. And try to figure this out, because this will also help you to get a better understanding of your athlete. So keep this classification number 1 in mind, double leg movements versus single leg movements. Second classification, certain athletes, they like to push the weight away from the body center of mass. For example, in a squat here, yeah, we are pushing the movement away. Other athletes, they like to pull the weight. Yeah, here, during a clean, the weight is pulled towards the body center of mass before the catching. Here in the squat, the weight is pushed away from the body center of mass. So another distribution or differentiation is pushers versus pullers. And the third one, we have athletes with relatively long ground contact times. I hope you can see the videos. So the jumper or sprinter here on the left, yeah, he has relatively long ground contact times while jumping, whereas this young girl here on the right, you can see she has very, very short ground contact times. So try to understand, is your athlete someone with slightly longer ground contact times? And that does not mean they're slow. In comparison to the average citizen, they will still be much faster. But these are the athletes, for example, like Usain Bolt, who probably having slightly longer legs, longer ground contact times, very powerful people, whereas athletes with very short ground contact times are often a bit more reactive. Yeah, and when we're talking about this classification, we usually have 2 groups. It's not always like, it might be a bit mixed, yeah, but we have athletes who like double leg movements, they are push orientated like a squat, they have slightly longer ground contact times, and often what we're able to observe, they have shorter tendons. If you compare the length of their calf muscle with the length of the Achilles tendon, you will find that these athletes often have relatively longer muscles and shorter tendons. On the other hand, we have these athletes who prefer single leg movements, pull orientated, very short ground contact times. And these athletes, remember Kipchoge, for example, or Usain Bolt, have relatively long tendons, yeah, but short calf muscles, short gastrocnemius and soleus muscles. And interestingly, the group on the left, they, in comparison, shows often a slightly less amount of fast twitch fibers. The group on the right, a slightly higher amount of fast twitch fibers. They can still be successful. Yeah, again, we're talking about a high level in comparison to an average citizen. But it helps you to identify the kind of training your athletes might need. Yeah, you know, these are probably the athletes who need slightly more volume in training, still on a high quality, on a high intensity. But these athletes often need lesser volume, but even more intensity in training. Again, we're not talking about an endurance training here. Yeah? The focus should always be on quality and intensity. But you all know that sometimes we have sprinters or jumpers who are, probably for them it's enough to have 4 or 5 sessions a week. And these are usually these athletes. We also have sprinters and jumpers who might say 7, 8 sessions a week. These are the ones we find on the left hand. Yeah, so try to get an understanding of your athlete, try to classify them, because this will help you with an improved training. So if you take all this into consideration, yeah, I will give you a short overview. I will quickly run through it, what to do in the different phases. In general preparation, yeah, in the first mesocycle with juice athletes, we usually do hypertrophy. And we continue with the hypertrophy. In special preparation, we focus on power, and then in pre-competition, power and speed strength and plyometrics. It does not mean that we're not affecting power at all in general preparation. We can do that. It just means that the emphasis here is on these training methods. And you can see there is no strength endurance at the beginning of the season any longer. The reason we don't use inter or intramuscular strength training for the under 18 athletes is because we need a higher intensity. Yeah, we need intensities higher than 90%, and that might be too much for a body even in late adolescence, in the later part of the puberty. So we need to ensure that the athletes are physically fully matured before we can use the higher intensities. And that's why for the 15, 16, 17-year-old athletes in general preparation, we conduct mainly hypertrophy program, even though we're knowing that these might come along with an extended or increased body weight. Yeah, with the under 20 athletes, and again, this is not necessarily based on the calendaric age. Yeah, you have to consider the physical maturity overall. In the beginning, maybe the first mesocycle, the first 3 to 4 weeks, we're doing some hypertrophy so that they're getting used to the training, but then immediately we start with inter or intramuscular strength. You can see a higher number of repetitions before focusing on intramuscular and power and special preparation, and then in pre-competition again, power and speed. For senior athletes, we skip this hypertrophy because their body is well developed. We can directly start with some intermuscular strength. Some athletes even start with intramuscular, what I mentioned here in the second phase. Yeah, so the first phase again is just getting used to the load of strength training. Then we're going ahead with intramuscular, very high intensities. That means a lower number of repetitions, even increasing this intensity during special preparation, combining it with power, and in pre-competition, find the same picture, focusing on power, speed, strength, and plyometrics. We talked about variability, and what I mentioned, it does not make sense to use the same exercises throughout a macrocycle, throughout your training here. So we need to find certain sequences to provide a certain variation. Yeah, and here I just give you some examples, but please be creative and also consider again the preferences of your athletes, because in pre-competition we want to give them a good feeling regarding strength in the gym. Yeah, we want to make them feel comfortable. That means you have to use exercises your athletes actually like to conduct. But if you want to train your gluteus, for example, the hip extensors, you might start with a double leg press in the beginning of the season, very small hip angles, because with smaller hip angles, the impact on the glutes is always increasing. Maybe followed by a deep squat, followed by a single leg squat, and some reactive box steps at the end, close to the competitions. So you see each phase we're using different exercises, still affecting the same muscles, but we just want to provide some variation to the central nervous system. If you do it for hamstrings, you can start, for example, with a Nordic hamstring exercise, followed by some eccentric hamstring curls, as you've seen it in the video, followed by good mornings, and maybe some quick or jumping lunges in pre-competitions with very little weight. If you're a thrower, you can probably start with a bench press. Afterwards, you use a declined bench press to have a slightly different angle in your shoulder joint. You might go ahead with single arm dumbbells to increase the intensity during special preparation. Maybe in pre-competition, you focus on some reactive heavy medicine ball throws. Yeah, so just to give you an idea, but again, it's your task as a coach to be creative here, to structure these exercises in a proper and holistic way for your athletes to be constantly challenged and to have a huge variety. Because if you're using the same exercises over and over again throughout your training year, you can be assured that your athletes at a certain point will not adapt any longer, and you can definitely be assured that they will get bored of your training. And that's something we have to avoid, because think of it, training always has to be fun. So a very few aspects at the end of our presentation. When you're conducting strength training, especially maximum strength training, we should always look for so-called utilization. And utilization is a Latin word. It just means we're making use of our acquired strengths. And if you combine strength training with very quick movements or reactive work after your strength session, the effect of your maximum strength training will even be increased. To give you an example, so let's say in general preparation, you do a single leg squat or so. Immediately afterwards, we want to go for quick movement. And we know that a squat with heavy weights is a very slow movement, but we also know that in athletics, we're looking for quick movements. So immediately after our squats, we're adding a few vertical jumps, for example, vertical single leg jumps. Yeah, just to apply the strength we just trained in a very quick way. So that the central nervous system exactly knows what to do with this strength. Another example is a reactive depth jumps. Yeah, if you do a clean, for example, I really like to combine that. There's the video. You're starting with a box and you go for a very quick movement. You can see the height of the hurdle. Here's a 106 hurdle, including a 15 centimeter block underneath it. So you can see a very powerful athlete, and extremely important, this also helps you with the amortization. That's what we're going to discuss next week. Yeah, how to apply reactive strength. But just add a few of such jumps after your strength session, and it will definitely help you to improve the quality and the effect of your strength training. Yeah, remind the body about the eventual movement, and that has to be quick. In strength training, that's something you have to be aware of. Every additional load slows you down. Yeah, so give a constant reminder after every session, or maybe even immediately after the exercise, to the body that it has to develop into a speed-related direction. I mentioned that in pre-competition, the focus is usually on speed, strength, and power. And even if you affect the speed, strength, or power training, yeah, speed, strength, and power is usually considered to be the same. It makes sense to have a so-called pre-activation. So before having maybe your 3-4 sets of 40 to 60% of the 1 repetition maximum, it might help you to go for 1 or 2 sets where you actually go for very high intensities, maybe 90% of your 1 repetition maximum, to pre-tense the muscle. And that's again due to the fast twitch fibers. Remember that your body as relatively lazy. So the body always wants to utilize the slow twitch fibers. And if you go for a repetition with 90% and more, maybe only 2 or 3 reps, yeah, you are able to activate all the fast twitch fibers within a muscle. And then you have around 5 to 7 minutes where these muscle fibers stay activated. And that's what we call pre-activation. That if you go for heavy loads, not to train maximum strength, but just to activate the fibers before a speed strength session, this will also help you to improve the effect of your session. And I will give you an example here. Forget about the text. You can see this athlete again. She's doing an eccentric leg press with heavy weights to pretense. Yeah, 3 to 4 repetitions each side. Very slow movement, very heavy weight. You can see the hamstring muscle, the glutes are almost shaking. But again, it's only one set, and we're only going for a few repetitions and followed by very quick repetitions. There's the same movement, but now in a very quick way, and only 40 to 60%. You can see this here of the 1 repetition maximum. And then the last stage is bounding. Again, it's the quickest way to utilize the strengths. And by using such sequences, reactivating the muscle with a high intensity, followed by a speed strength training, followed by some bounding, you have a high chance that your training will be more efficient. Yeah, that's it. I know it was a long discussion today. I hope it was not too technical, and that you got some ideas on how to improve your strength session the next time. And yeah, if there are any questions, please share them now in the chat group.
Before that, Volker, I just request our president, do he have any input in this session? Sir, you are here, sir. President, sir, are you here? Hello. Sir, are you here, sir? Okay, you can proceed. Hello. You can start with the question answering session.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So first question is, what is the proper age to start an athlete to do strength training?
Yeah, you obviously missed the first session because that's what we discussed during the athlete's development. You have to, with the young athletes, you should track the growth. Yeah, how much are they growing each month to identify the growth spurt and the peak height velocity. As soon as female athletes reach the peak height velocity, and it's usually around the age of 13, 14, that's when you slowly have to introduce strength training. For boys, it's normally 12 to 18 months after they reach the peak height velocity. Yeah, but remember, you have to start with simple exercises, maybe a leg press, 10 to 12 repetitions, maybe 70% intensity. So do it slowly and don't increase the rates too rapidly because the body has to get used to it. And if you're starting at such a young age, what we actually supporting from a scientific perspective, you have to ensure that our athletes are already dealing with a decent level of core strength.
Thank you, sir. Sir, next question is, they didn't understand about the eccentric strength. That is, you mentioned that 90 to 140%. Can you elaborate that one more time, sir?
If you're doing or conducting eccentric strength training, when the muscle is activated but lengthening, we are able to increase the intensity because of the way the cross bridges within the muscle cell have been built. But again, that's something we should keep for the senior athletes above the age of 20.
Okay, sir, can you elaborate about the isokinetic exercises? If they have to do it isokinetic, what is isokinetic exercises and when we should do it?
Yeah, I'm to be honest, I think this term isokinetic is a bit misleading because it means that you have to have the same activation, the same power throughout the movement, and that's almost impossible. There are ideas to have a similar velocity throughout the movement, but you need very specified and expensive machines. They are good for testing and even for intensive training sessions, but don't get too confused. Don't get too confused regarding this isokinetic training. Personally, it's a very theoretical model, and I don't really believe it. Yeah, it's very hard because it means you need a constant speed and you need a proper machine. Otherwise, the speed will always be different. And I'm not sure whether we have such machines in India. Yeah, it means that if you start your bench press, that the speed is exactly the same as if you have an almost extended position. But remember this force length and force velocity relationship. Again, I think it's very theoretically and not applicable to our current situation.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, can you explain one more time regarding the hypertrophy? You told that hypertrophy is not required at all, and anatomical adaptation.
No.
Can you explain one more time, sir? There are so many questions regarding this.
Now, hypertrophy means you're working on your maximum strength, but at the same time, your muscle size is getting bigger. The muscle is growing. And this is increasing the so-called cross-section of your muscle. Yeah, if you cut your muscle in half, the cross-section or the circumference is increasing. And this is something we want to avoid if possible, because it directly means if the muscle mass is increasing, that your body weight is increasing too. So if we have other ways to increase the strength, like inter or intramuscular strength training, it will be much more beneficial because we're maintaining the body weight and we're increasing the strength, and that will directly cause a much higher acceleration. So again, with the very young athletes, at the age of under 18, we cannot use such high intensities because they're still growing. We have to conduct hypertrophy training with these athletes. But and also with some of the throwers, we want to increase the muscle mass or the body weight because it will help them to create a certain momentum, which we can apply to the implement afterwards during the release. But with sprinters, jumpers, middle distance runners, we want to avoid hypertrophy. And if we see that our athletes are increasing the strength with inter and intramuscular strength training, there is no need to conduct hypertrophy training. If maybe after 2 years of strength training, you see, okay, they're not improving any longer, then it might make sense even for the senior athletes to implement 4-6 weeks of hypertrophy training before going back to the intramuscular strength training. Yeah, but we should try to avoid hypertrophy, again, because it will have a negative impact on our body weight, and increased body weight will directly slow us down.
Thank you, sir. Sir, another question from, is it important to train strength endurance for speed endurance and endurance athletes? Is it important to train strength endurance for speed endurance and endurance athlete?
Yes.
For 800 and 1500 meters.
Yes, definitely. Like you need to conduct strength endurance training, especially for the middle and long distance athletes, even for the 400 meters, because it also helps you with the so-called local muscular endurance, with the number of mitochondria. So a strength endurance training can definitely help you to improve the endurance level as well. Even some sprinters, they're conducting a bit of strength endurance in the beginning of the seasons, not, and that's very important, not as a preparation for strength training, but to improve the aerobic capacity. Yeah, because sprinters usually, they don't like to run a lot. So you might be able to use strength endurance also to work on the aerobic capacity, and that will have a positive impact on the necessary recovery time.
Sir, can you explain the Nordic hamstring exercise, whether they should stop somewhere or what angle they should go, like that, sir? Nordic hamstring?
Yes. Maybe let me check. Yesterday I took some videos. I went through some videos. Maybe we can have a look. Yeah, I can't find the video right now, but I think you all know that here it is. Okay, let me share my screen again. So we have actually two variations of the Nordic hamstring. I only found this now. I hope you can see that. Yeah, here, this is a variation I really like because the impact is a bit higher due to the hip movement. Normally, a Nordic hamstring means you're in this position, you're going up and down. Very important with a fully extended hip joint. You should actually, if you're able to do it, you should try to go up and down with a fully extended hip as often as possible. I've had an athlete who was able to do that even with a medicine ball in his extended arm, and he was able to go up and down 3 times. In India, I have not seen a single athlete so far who was able to do it once. So that's something we probably have to introduce a bit earlier because it's a very specific strength exercise for the hamstring muscles. And we've realized that most of our athletes actually are a bit weak when it comes to the hamstrings. So yeah, do this exercise. Be ensured that you have a soft surface like a mat or maybe 2 or 3 towels for the knees, that there's no injury risk for the knee joint, but there's no limit to it. Yeah? And of course you start maybe with an upright position and the athlete will collapse in the beginning, but after a while they will hopefully be able to perform a full Nordic hamstring coming up and down entirely. Just do me one favor, don't use this exercise any longer after maybe mid or end of special preparation phase. Because what I mentioned, the way this exercise is affecting the central nervous system is not the correct one when it comes to sprinting and jumping. In sprints, jumps, running, we always have a more or less fixed hip joint and the knee joint is moving. With the Nordic hamstring, we actually turning this structure around. The knee joint is fixed and the hip is moving. So it's exactly the opposite than the actual movement, and that's something we want to avoid to reduce the number of injuries. But it's a very good exercise, especially if you don't have the machines for general preparation and beginning of special preparation.
Thank you, sir. Sir, can you elaborate complex training? There's so many questions regarding complex training. Is it advisable to do it or not after the weight training sessions, going for jumps or something like that? Just
yes, of course, yeah, but don't call it complex training. I think the complex training is always misleading because every training session has to be very specific and it has to fulfill the purpose. Yeah, what I mentioned at the beginning, never conduct a strength session just for the sake of strength training. Every session has to have a very specific objective, a very clear target, and we should use a utilization, yes, after every single session. You can do plyometrics, not a lot. Sometimes 2 or 3 sets of just 3 or 4 repetitions is enough. You can conduct a few high-frequency drills. Again, not with the purpose of improving your technique, but just to link the movement you acquired or the strength you acquired during your strength session with technical aspects of your key event.
Sir, next question is regarding the hill training and sand training, sir. What is his suggestions for hill training and sand training when it comes to strength part, sir?
Yeah, personally, I'm not a huge fan of sand training. If you want to improve the strength or running, I think you can definitely do it in general preparation, but don't do it more than once a week. Because the problem with sand training is we always have very long ground contact times. 200, 300, sometimes 400 milliseconds. But remember, in athletics, in all events, we try to reduce the ground contact times. So by doing a lot of workouts in the sand, we actually slowing the athlete down. And that's something we need to avoid. Another disadvantage of sand training is that we often have very unstable undergrounds. Yeah, it's a kind of shaky, and if your athlete is getting tired, there's another risk of injuries, not only on the ankle joint, but also on the knee joint, because we always have to avoid the so-called shear forces, yeah? Forces which are not acting through the joint, but with a small angle, because these are the forces which are usually causing injuries. So be a bit careful. You can do sand training definitely, but for a different purpose, to improve the balance or the stiffness. Yeah, if you do, and that's something we're going to have a session on next week. If you do conduct a session in the sand, just with a focus on balance and maybe some isometric landings, then it's definitely okay. But again, mainly for general preparation and not more than once, maybe 2 times a session. Hill work is the same. Often hill work is misused as speed training, because the concept behind hill training is not a speed training, it's actually a strength training. Yeah, and it's a relatively specific form of strength training if you keep a small inclination angle. If you have a high angle, it's a very unspecific load, which you can probably use in general preparation. On the other hand, if you keep the angle below 2 to 3 degrees, then it becomes a very specific form of speed-related strength training. The disadvantage, again, I see with hill training is that it might have a negative impact on your technique. And the other disadvantage is that if you're running on a steep hill, that the action is more focusing on the quadriceps rather than the glutes and the hamstrings. And Mr. Radhakrishnan and I, when we went through the different training centers, especially with our junior athletes, we've realized that a lot of our athletes are dealing with a muscular disbalance. In India, we will find the majority of athletes where the hamstring muscles, the so-called posterior chain, is much weaker in comparison to the posterior chain, the anterior chain, sorry. So that means the hamstrings are, in comparison to the quadriceps, too weak. And the reason of this is, for example, that if you're conducting hill training, that you focus more on the quadriceps and lesser on the hamstrings and the glutes. And the same applies to stair jumps, for example. Yeah, so be very careful with that. We have to focus more on the prime movers. We need to identify what are the prime movers, and we have to develop the prime movers and not, for example, a quadriceps muscle, which is not that much required in the sprints or the middle and long distances.
Thank you, sir.
Rajmohan, with this last question, I think we can end the question and answer session. And I request somebody, there are so many questions, they can be addressed to coacheseducation.afi@gmail.com. And
yeah, the address is education@indianaathletics.in, I think.
And then the last question, that is, what is the best method to strengthening of tendons and ligaments? That is from Mr. Bharat Singh of NIS Patiala. What is the best method for strength training of tendons and ligaments?
Yeah, that's actually isometric and eccentric strength training. And I feel we have to probably conduct maybe another class on this isometric or eccentric strength training, but this is mainly applying to senior athletes. So yeah, let's do that later. And as Mr. Radhakrishnan mentioned, send your questions to to education@indianaathletics.in. And probably within the next weeks, we can have a specific question answering regarding these questions. Thank you very much already from my side. I hope it was a fruitful session for you. And yeah, see you in 2 days' time.
Thank you, Walter. And I now just request our president, Sri Adil Sumariwalaji, to add something on this today's session.
Thank you, Radha. Thank you, Volker. It was a very, very interesting session. I must admit there are so many things I did not know. And I'm sure there are lots of coaches who did not know. a lot of things. I think also maybe the coaches knew certain things, but I don't think they knew it in perspective and why we did certain things. For in the time when we were running, there was some 7 basic exercises from squats to leg press to bench press to shoulder press to clean and jerk, and basically that was that. We only worked on basic 3 groups of muscles: the quadriceps, the hamstrings, and the calf for the lower body, and shoulder and chest for the upper body. It's so refreshing to see the scientific development that has happened, or was there in the world, but we didn't know anything about it at that time. But I'm glad that our coaches today have this opportunity to understand. Some of this was quite high level as I was watching. I hope our coaches have understood this. I hope that they can take this back, think through it, and plan their training for their athletes. We were only talking mostly about muscles. Very few of us talked about ligaments. So there were so many new things that even I learned today, and I'm glad that we are doing these courses. I think our coaches are really blessed that we can have these sort of courses from time to time. I wish you go back and tell your other fellow coaches to join in this program, because this sort of education will not keep happening. It is thanks to the COVID virus that we are all locked in, because once the lockdown is over, we will all be busy with many other things, getting our athletes ready for the Olympic Games, traveling with them, going to competitions, etc. And then we are not going to have as much time to sit and prepare these sessions for you. Let me tell you, these sessions don't come easy. There's a lot of hard work which the team does, led by Folka, Radha, and our assistant coach, the other national coaches. They do a lot of work to prepare these presentations for you. Once again, my request is, I don't understand why our coaches can't understand basic English, but they will come in the morning and good morning everybody, so and so from Bangalore, so and so from Maharashtra. Please don't put it. Your attendance will not be counted. So please don't put your names there. And we have decided now that anybody who puts his name in the beginning, their attendance will not be counted for Sai. So please don't put your names. We are not going to count your attendance. So your attendance will be done later after the full session is over. So please cooperate. Please don't fill up, because if you, then all the questions will be missed. These people are going back and trying to answer all the questions. It's a whole day job for them, that they're doing this for you. So please cooperate. Please cooperate. I think it was an excellent session. What session are we doing tomorrow?
There is no session tomorrow. I like to inform all participants as well. Tomorrow there is no session. On day after tomorrow we have session on fundamentals of throws.
Of throws, okay, excellent. I think again, throws is a big thing in India, especially with a lot of our throwers in the past winning Asian Games, Commonwealth Games. People like our chief coach Bahadur Singh must be here, and we have Neeraj, we have Shivpal, 2 people who have qualified for the games. So in the past we've had Toor and many other throwers who've been Asian champions or common, like Seema Antil, Krishna Punya. So I am sure India is one event India can do well. So I hope everybody pays attention to this program. Thank you very much. Thank you, Folka, Radha, and your team, and good luck.
Thank you, sir. Now we are going to conclude this session. Once again, I'm informing all of you that tomorrow we will not be having any session, and we'll start the session on 30th morning at same at 10 a.m. And मैं हिंदी में भी बोलता हूँ क्योंकि लास्ट वेडनेसडे देयर आर सो मेनी, बहुत लोगों ने लॉग इन किया था उसी टाइम पे, लेकिन उस दिन भी सेशन नहीं था. आपको ये इन्फॉर्म किया जाता है कि वेडनेसडे वी विल बी मीटिंग वेडनेसडे अगेन. हमको कोई सेशन कल नहीं है. नाउ आई विल हैंड ओवर टू मिस्टर कमाल अली खान as a host and we'll be meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much.